Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. How have you all been? I know it's been a while since my last video, but I saw this photo on Pinterest and I really wanted to paint it because I think it could go well with the differences that I use gouache and watercolor in applications. So I thought it would make an interesting video. I've been painting for quite a long time now, and especially with just these two mediums that are very similar to each other, I think that their components are pretty much the same things, and it's always hard for me to explain how different they are from each other just because at their core they're not really that much different. But in this video I wanted to show you guys how different they can be in application. Because I don't think I'm very good at explaining the differences between them, I thought that I would just show you in this one painting that I did. For the watercolor part of this process, I will be using my Schmincke watercolors, and of course for the Holbein part of the process, and of course for the gouache part of the process, I will be using my Holbein gouache set. So the very main thing that drew me to this photo is the differences in the foreground, how brightly lit she is in the foreground and how warm and how dark and cool the colors are for the background. So I thought those two aspects of it would really work well for watercolor and gouache respectively. So I think of this painting as having two parts. And the very first one is the watercolor part, which is what we'll be doing right here. And I also like to think of them as two independent parts of the process. So I would use very different techniques for this painting. So the very first part, which is her in the foreground, I want to use very warm and very light colors. So I also don't want to go very dark for this part of the painting. So there's a lot of the highlights just being the paper, so a lot of breathing room for the paper in this watercolor part of the painting. One other thing too that I liked to play around with is the shapes that I could get with the colors, because I don't want to overdo the differences in the values. I don't want to go super dark. I wanted to play around with the shapes. I wanted to exaggerate the kinds of shapes that I was getting, especially for her hat. I feel like those lines, the straw lines for the very edges, I wanted really to get that in this initial painting. And of course, the very brightest parts is just the paper. I really wanted to show in this part of the process, I really want to show what the paper looks like underneath. And I wanted to use very, very thin paint for this part. So even though when I do go to darker and cooler colors, you will still be able to see the paper underneath, and this part of the painting will always look brighter than especially the background. So as you can see, since it's all mostly very minimal layers for this part, I'm experimenting with different colors beside each other. I wanted to make sure that I'm having fun with the colors that I choose, as well as adding blue for the shadows on her face. I'm also adding a little bit of greenish color to the shadows on her shoulder. So those two colors, while they are opposite to the yellows and the oranges especially that we use mostly for the foreground, they work for this part because I made sure that when I do use them that they're very watered down, especially the blue and the orange. Those two next to each other, if they're both very intense, could make this very dark and gray color. They could cancel each other out, so I don't want that. So whenever I do use the blue, I wanted to make sure that I'm using it very sparingly. And you can see it on her face. It just looks cool enough in certain parts of her face where it looks like it's in shadow, but I don't want to use too much of the blue to gray out any of the oranges that I have for her hat and her hair. So her shirt too, it's just a white shirt, but since everything else is very bright, I did go ahead and just went crazy with the colors that I was using. I mainly just went with whatever I could find in my palette and made sure that since I wasn't overthinking the colors too much, I wanted to leave out a lot of the highlights. And so I'm just painting in the folds right here, making sure that I'm using very sharp lines for how her shirt is folding. Other than that, it's mostly just still the paper that we can see underneath. And yeah, it's just enough to make it look like there's already form in this very first layer with our watercolors. And even though one of the looks that I always strive to achieve with watercolors is this bright and airy look that we can get, especially with just the paper peeking underneath, I still wanted to get some definition on her, and so I'm using multiple layers. But one main thing I wanted to do for this painting, and especially just on this part, is I wanted to make sure that I was using the darker colors very minimally. So I would just still use my burnt siennas and my oranges. When I do need them to be a little bit darker, I would just mix some of my blues to them because they cancel each other out. Still, though, I didn't want to overdo it. I just wanted to make it look like there's just enough definition on there. On areas like her hair, I wanted those to stand out, but I also wanted them to look very soft. So you will see me throughout this painting work with wet on wet techniques, where I would paint some of the shadows on her hat before I paint the darker color of her hair on top of it. So they would just move onto each other and give this very soft look. It's really the kind of look that I was going for this painting. I think for her face, I was a little bit more careful. So I would use very thin shadows for it. And I do this technique where I lay the colors down on her face first before I take a clean brush and stretch it out to the rest of the shadow. But these are very delicate, very thin layers of color, even though on some areas, especially on her face where I wanted to get definition, I would reach maybe a third layer on top of it. You will still be able to see the paper underneath. It will still look like it's very bright, and later on, especially when we start with the gouache, it will look like it's actually glowing just because we see the paper. And with the gouache, we will be covering the background completely with a dark color, so it's just going to be very delicious, the differences between the two in this painting. I can't wait to get to that part of the gouache. But yeah, for this watercolors, a lot of very thin layers, and also incorporating the color of the paper for our brightest highlights in our photo. So after that's done, we are now going to move on to our gouache part of the process. I will be using this very intense dark gouache color. I believe this is Lamp Black by Holbein. It's either that or it's Black by Mayberry, but both of them are very, very dark. And as you can see, while we were painting the watercolors, then it looked very nice and bright. The colors, after they have dried, have settled down and they have kind of looked much lighter. So especially when we put in this black outline around her, it's gonna make her look like she's glowing. It's gonna make the whole painting look luminescent. It's so exciting to see, and especially on this part of the process where I'm excruciatingly painting around the very straight jagged edges of her straw hat, essentially leaving out some of it as just the color of the paper. It's so exciting to see because it really brings out the colors in the very first layer. So with gouache, it's much more opaque than watercolors, so we can do the opposite direction where with the watercolors you wanted to leave out as much of the paper as possible. For the gouache, we're actually working with our darkest color as the first layer, so we will be covering up the paper entirely. And as you can see, even though it's it's gouache and it's mainly the same components as watercolor. It's so dark and it's subtle so evenly that it's kind of differentiates itself from the watercolors in that way. I don't know if many of you guys have used the black or very dark color with watercolors before, but it's always so hard to get an even lay down of a darker color with watercolor. With gouache, and especially with this super dark color with gouache, I don't even really need to worry about or think about how I can get this black to look even, because as you can see, after it has dried, it sort of evened itself out. It's not very patchy, or at least it looks like I'm trying to get it to be an even color even though I wasn't really. It's just, I think, the nature of gouache that you can do this. This is something that's very hard to do with watercolors, and yeah, it's just one of those key difference that immediately to me stands out when I'm working with both of them. So as you can see, I, even though it's one even laydown of the black, I also wanted to make sure that I was getting these shapes already with it that would complement the background, just so that when we add in the details on top, this will look like it's also adding into the deeper layers of our background. So once we had that really good solid base for the background, it's finally time for the most exciting part, which is to slowly add on the foliage on top. So we're going to build up to our background in two different ways. The first one is to build it up in values of our colors. So we're going to be starting off with our darkest greens first. I even mixed in some of my raw umber for with the green so I can get it to be very dark. And I am starting with those darkest greens first, and then we're slowly gonna make it lighter and lighter as we draw the ones that are closest to the foreground. So I think this one is interesting because gouache has this quality where the darker colors, when you paint them, will actually dry lighter. So the very first ones I laid down don't really show up until after they dry. So as we go on to the video, you will get to see more of the very first ones that I've laid down. So it's always so fun to see on film. But then the flip side to that is that the lighter colors will also dry darker. So it's also something that you kind of have to compensate for as you're mixing our colors with the background. I think that this is one of those things that also happens with watercolors just because they have such a similar make in that way. But with watercolors and how you apply them, it isn't really as apparent, I don't think. And especially the lighter colors drying duller and darker, I don't immediately notice that so much with watercolors, but maybe it's just because we don't really paint the lighter colors in watercolors, we just sort of just paint around them. So the other way that I like to build up the depth in the background is to build it up in the opacity of our paint. So if you want to paint lighter colors that are also towards the back of the background, like the brighter blues that I used to paint the rocks and the stones, the way that I would push it back is I would just add a lot of water to it, a lot of water to my paint, which again makes it more transparent. And so after it dries, we will still be able to see the dark background underneath, and it wouldn't look like it's too close to us, and it still be pushed back. And so as we go up, when we get closer to the foreground, we'll just slowly add less and less water to our paint until we get to a point where our gouache is so thick that we won't really be able to see the background anymore. So this is how my painting looks after everything. I am so happy with how it turned out, and especially just the separation between the two. I think it worked really well. I did add an extra layer to the watercolors on her shirt, which I think I shouldn't have done because it kind of pushed the color of her shirt back and made it look, while I liked the color blue on it, I felt like it pushed it back more, which I should have just left it as it was. But other than that, I'm just now gonna polish up some of the details. I'm also now not looking at them as two independent parts of the painting. I'm now looking at the painting in its entirety and trying to see how well it will work by itself. And also another thing is, I'm at this point of the process, I'm not looking at the reference photo anymore, which is something that I like to do when I'm getting closer towards the end. Is I try to make sure that the painting works as a painting, try to see my painting as itself and trying to see if I can get it to at least stand on its own as well as the photo does, because it's amazing. And again, please don't forget that all of the reference photos I use in my videos are in one reference board, and they're up on Pinterest and they're linked in the description. Yeah, another thing that I did do towards the very end is add in connecting color between the two. I think for this, it's mostly the yellow. So a lot of yellows in the background. And so I did also try to add in this lemon yellow for her and to outline our brightest highlights on her. But other than that, that's really it for the painting. It looks like there's so much that went into it, but it's really very simple. The entire painting, after everything is edited down, only was just an hour long. So it's one of those things that work really well as a tutorial too. So again, if you guys are interested in that, I have that on my Patreon. But yeah, that is really it for this one. I do add in a little bit more for this final bit, but it's mostly just reinforcing what we've done until this point. So yeah, that is really it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. I so love this photo so much. If you guys made it through to the end, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons, especially for supporting me. You guys are the best. And please let me know what you think of the video, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.